Hey guys, Michael here. Welcome back to Gaming for Immersion, and I want to go ahead and say right away that this is a video that is not going to be of interest to everyone. This is going to be a bunch of very nerdy gaming philosophy type of a conversation. Some of you are going to listen to what I have to say here and think, what on earth is he talking about? Who cares? And that's fine. So I just want to be upfront about that. So I want to save you some time. If this sort of thing doesn't interest you at all, then please feel free to click away. Anyway, some of you are going to listen to this, and you're going to know exactly where I'm going to come from. You might have thought about this particular one yourself, and then others are going to think, that's kind of interesting, but I never thought about that one before. So what on earth am I even talking about? So this is a conversation about cheese in this game, and also really how cheese is sort of in the eye of the beholder, right? So one person's cheese may not be another person's cheese. In other words, there are exploits that you can do in this game that some people would consider an exploit and other people wouldn't consider an exploit. I always talk about how I like to try to stay thematic and avoid abusing the AI and avoid exploits. So I don't do things like run a really fast unit all around the map to draw fire away until the enemy has, expended all their ammunition shooting at something that they're never going to hit, or, to lead half of their army on a wild goose chase to run after a unit that they have no hope of ever catching up to, while the rest of their army gets beaten down by the rest of mine. Little things like that. These are, there's sort of a fine line between what Sun Tzu would call, really intelligent tactics or strategy. You want to make feints. You want to try to draw the enemy into places that are advantageous to yourself. But at the same time, once we learn exactly how the AI responds to particular situations, then we learn how to abuse it, basically. So what I've got here in the background is a battle that is going to be very similar to what I'm sure many of you have run into yourselves, which is we're being hit by multiple armies, or in this case, we're attacking multiple armies, and we have one really strong army, and we have some kind of a reinforcing force, which is pretty unimpressive. We don't need it. And what we're going up against in this case are multiple pretty strong armies. And what we have the option to do is control large army or not. So I will admit, I never really thought about this as an exploit before. And I was playing a multiplayer game with my brother who has just started playing this game and he knows that I like to avoid exploiting things. I don't think he has much of a problem with it as I do, but he knows I don't like to. And so I was talking to him about a fight that we were getting into, or that I guess he was getting into, that was this sort of a situation where he was fighting multiple armies that individually were weaker than his starting army. Individually weaker, but in total, if you fought all of them at the same time, it would have been a much, much more difficult battle. So anyway, I told him all you have to do is uncheck that control large army. And what this means for anybody who's not familiar with it is that it's your starting 20 against their starting 20 until any of the units, for whatever reason, either rout or get destroyed, are off the battlefield. And then that's when the reinforcements come in. So it's 20v20. So let's talk about one reason right away why a lot of players are going to want to use this, and that's performance. And I perfectly understand it's possibly why CA put it in the game to begin with. But like I said, I never thought about this really until my brother mentioned it, that it's not just a performance thing. Obviously, you can elect to do this even if you're not doing it for performance reasons, but if you see my starting 20 are better than his starting 20, the AI starting 20 that is, or really maybe my starting 20 on the map at one time versus any 20 of the enemy gives me my best chance to win the battle. So hopefully all that makes sense. So you have this option, you uncheck it, and it's a 20v20 battle. It's just that the reinforcements won't come in until some of the original 40 units that are on there, 20 on each side, are either routed off the battlefield or are destroyed. So it obviously works in our favor here, and this is my Epidemius campaign. It worked here in our favor because obviously I've got some extremely strong Exalted Plaguebearer units here that are, 20v20, the match for just about anything else that we're going to run into in this entire campaign, certainly in the earlier mid-game. So all we had to do here in this particular battle, blob up, nothing particularly fancy. They're extremely durable units. They get a little bit of buffs from the characters that I have in this battle. Anyway, pretty straightforward battle. Fought in the trees because the enemy was bringing in cavalry and large units and some ranged units. And anyway, you still want to fight your battles intelligently, obviously. But like I said, my starting 20 was basically more than a match for all 60 of Archaon's forces here. Or it might have been 80. I can't remember now if this was 4 armies that we went up against or 3. But anyway, so, certainly we were more than a match for them, even if we had tried to fight without turning off the control large army. In other words, that had been our 2 armies against all of theirs, all, upwards of 40v40. But it was still worked out, obviously, to our advantage to only do a 20v20. So where am I going with this? Is this an exploit? I never thought about this before, and I'm sure that some people have, but probably some people haven't. And so I'm kind of interested in ideas. I have not made up my mind one way or the other. I guess kind of instinctively, now that it has been pointed out to me, it kind of feels like one. It kind of feels like, yeah, there's no realistic reason why the enemy would not be able to bring multiple armies into this battle. Now, you can kind of, I think, thematically justify it because there are, this has obviously happened plenty of times in the course of history when fighting battles that, you might have a much larger army, but they're not all able to arrive on the battlefield at the same time. And so, you end up running into situations where a smaller army has been able to win because they didn't have to fight the entire larger army at the same time. It kind of happens all the time, but it's usually some type of weird happenstance that causes it, or, the road network just isn't conducive to it, or for whatever reason. It's not usually something that the smaller army had in their control, although there may be some situations. I mean, Thermopylae, for example, obviously that's a situation where they were, by choosing their terrain, they were able to only fight a small part of the overall attacking army at any one time. But that's pretty rare. Those are the exceptions more than the rule. In this game, you don't have to have gone through anything elaborate like that to set up in a particularly defensible choke point. It's just a matter of, as long as you have at least 2 armies, at least 21 units, then you have this option. So I'm curious what other people think. Like I said, my instinct is that it probably is, but at the same time, from a functional perspective, I see the value of it. And I'm in favor of things that, mechanics in the game that basically put the player in a position to have to make important decisions. This is a really important tactical decision. Do I, want to fight by controlling large army or not? And so I'm kind of, even though I kind of feel like maybe it is an exploit, it's at the same time sort of a mechanic that I'm reluctant to just say, okay, no, I'm never going to do it, because I like that additional level of complexity that the player has in terms of their decision making. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. Maybe some of you have more mature thoughts on this particular topic than I do, because like I said, this one is kind of a recent one that's popped into my mind. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you've thought about this before or not, and what, whether this is something you've thought about before or something that you're just coming to. Let me know what you think in terms of whether or not you consider this to be cheese. Do you consider this to be an exploit? Do you think the only valid reason to do it is performance, or can you think of some more thematic / realistic reasons to allow it as well? Hopefully all that makes sense. Let me know also, if you think this kind of video is at all interesting. I kind of like doing things a little bit differently, putting out some content that's a little bit different than what everybody else does. And I don't know too many, YouTubers in the Warhammer space who have discussions like this in their videos. But then again, I also don't know all of them out there. So maybe there are others who already talk about stuff like this. So anyway, anything that you have to say on the topic and whether you think these types of topics would be interesting to make future videos on, please let me know as well. And if so, if you have a particular idea for a topic to talk about in terms of, immersion or exploiting or, anything basically related to nerd game philosophy type things, let me know. All right. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there. Hopefully, like I said, all that makes sense. But if you had any questions or anything, please feel free to go ahead and ask them in the comments below. And I think with all of that, I will go ahead and say, let me know your thoughts. But in any case, thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I will see you all in the next video.